Well, it gives me great pleasure to introduce the first speaker of the winter season. He's a friend. He's a wonderful professional colleague. He's a gifted teacher at Dartmouth. And last but not least, he's a fellow member of the Athenaeum. James Heffernan was educated at Georgetown and Princeton, and he spent almost his entire professional career at Dartmouth, where he's a professor of English, and he also has another wonderful title, which is the Frederick Sessions Beebe Professor in the Art of Writing. Wouldn't it be nice if every English professor had a title like that today? Jim Heffernan is an English romanticist. His first book, published in 1969, Wordsworth's Theory of Poetry, was cited as one of the two best books published on Wordsworth in the 1960s. He followed that with a very interesting interartistic book on Romanticism entitled The Recreation of Landscape, a study of Wordsworth, Coleridge, Constable, and Turner, a book that I've enjoyed reading very much, arguing with just a little bit, but mostly benefiting from enormously. And then, in 1993, he published an absolutely central book in the study of the relationship between literature and the visual arts. It was published by Chicago, and it's entitled Museum of Words, The Poetics of Ekphrasis from Homer to Ashbery. And I should also point out that Jim Heffernan has, on behalf of the teaching company, produced a series of 24 lectures on video and audio tape on James Joyce's Ulysses, and he's currently preparing another series on great authors of the 19th and 20th centuries. When Jim Heffernan was working on his book on ekphrasis, he became very interested in the problem of what it is we see when we look at an image, a visual image, and how we interpret it. And as he concedes, we really don't have a common name for what it is. It's not literacy. He's calling it picturacy. And so he's going to talk to us about literacy and picturacy this evening. So please join me in welcoming Jim Heffernan back to the Athenaeum.
Thank you very much, Richard, for those generous words. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be invited to speak at the Athenaeum and its splendidly renovated quarters. And given its equally splendid collection of books and pictures and sculptures, I can hardly imagine a better venue for a lecture on the reading of pictures. I want to say, too, that I warmly appreciate your bravery in facing the elements tonight, particularly the Arctic cold. I had a call the other day from an old friend who regretted his inability to come tonight in the face of temperatures that were going to drop to 10, maybe 10 below, I'm not sure. And I said, "Oh, John, that's perfectly all right. I quite understand, you wimp." But you're not wimps, and I'm very happy to see you here tonight. I must say, also reminded of a wonderful passage in Jane Austen's novel, Emma, in which Emma and her father, somewhat crotchety, Mr. Woodard, have been invited out to dinner about a mile away, and the temperature drops just low enough to produce about an inch of snow on the ground. And Mr. Woodard is very reluctant to go out on such an evening, and he finally agrees to go, but he says to Emma, "A man must think himself very agreeable indeed to expect his friends to come out on such a night." I can only say that I will strive mightily tonight to be as agreeable as possible. I begin with a story about Dan Rather, long-standing, or rather long-sitting anchorman for CBS Nightly News. Some years ago, Rather gave a speech to the National Press Club at one of its regular luncheon meetings in Washington, D.C. Predictably, Rather's topic was television news broadcasting, and he tried to give a candid account of its strengths and weaknesses. Even in the question period afterwards, when he was inevitably asked to compare televised news with printed news, to compare the broadcasting of images with the dissemination of words, he gamely admitted that journalists were typically more thorough than broadcasters. But having put that concession on the table, Rather played his ace. Television, he said confidently, does one thing that newspapers cannot. When it reports on what is happening somewhere else, television puts you there. And not long afterwards, when CBS was reporting on the U.S. invasion of Panama, rather repeated the point. Through the magic of television, he said, we take you there. This kind of statement could be dismissed as an innocuous metaphor if it were not calculated to take us, in a sense, quite different from the one rather intended, that is, to take us in, to foster the illusion that the television screen is a perfectly transparent window which allows us to see exactly what is happening anywhere in the world. In fact, television is a device that transmits and distributes pictures, just as the printing press is a device which duplicates and thus makes possible the distribution of words. A well-told story of an event or a vivid description of a place can put us there just as well, if not better, than a picture can, but neither words nor pictures can literally put us there. They can only represent what is there or what was there, and every act of representation is a construction of meaning. We can begin to read pictures only when we grasp the implications of this simple fact. Simple as it is, the concept of pictures as representations is difficult to grasp because we are conditioned virtually from childhood to regard them as having a privileged relation to what they represent. A relation so intimate that we grasp it instinctively with no sense of mediation or translation or decoding. That is what makes looking at pictures seem so different from reading words, and why the title of this essay sounds so strange. There is no such thing as picturacy in the English language, because the ability to read pictures is commonly thought to be, so to speak, written into the eye at birth, a product of instinct rather than education. Children commonly learn to read from picture books. In the child's picture book, the word is the signifier, the picture is the signifié, the thing signified. When the child sees the word tree under the picture of a barked pole sprouting leafy branches, he or she is invited to learn the arbitrary conventional link between the picture and the word. But at the same time, to see the picture, to recognize the picture as virtually identical with what it represents. To begin to read, to begin to acquire literacy, is to begin developing one of the most fundamental assumptions about the difference between pictures and words, that words are arbitrary and pictures natural, that words represent things by convention alone, while pictures represent them by natural resemblance. Even E.H. Gombrich, who has written at great length about the role that convention plays in art, declares that, quote, images of nature are not conventional signs, like the words of human language, but show a real visual resemblance not only to our eyes or our culture, but also to birds or beasts, unquote. And Jonathan Culler, well known for his untiring pursuit of signs, firmly locates pictures outside the domain of semiotics, the science of signification, because he says semiotics cannot account for natural resemblance. Well, the first thing to ask about natural resemblance is whether it is truly natural or merely naturalized by inculcation and habit. When a child sees a picture of a cozy little rose-covered cottage surrounded by a white picket fence and labeled home, does the child recognize a natural resemblance between the picture and the homes that he or she has actually seen? Or is the child being subtly taught to take this picture as a graphic sign of what we want to believe a home is? How often do children's picture books place the word home beneath a picture of a crowded, messy, one-bedroom apartment? How often does the word home appear beneath the picture of a tent, which is exactly where one family in my part of New Hampshire spent the summer a few years ago, camping out while trying to save enough money to rent an apartment for the winter? Would any picture book publisher dare to put the word home beneath the picture of a tent or a cramped apartment? So long as pictures present themselves as windows on a world of stable objects with fixed meanings, so long as we grant pictures a privileged relation to what they represent, questions like these do not arise. Our whole educational system is in fact designed to suppress them, to forestall questions about the meaning of pictures, because pictures are quite literally read out of the curriculum that we give children to study. Literacy, the ability to read words alone, is the universal criterion of cultural advancement. When children learn to read and write, they are systematically taught to move from finger painting to forming letters, from picture books to illustrated books, and finally to words alone, black letters stamped on a pure white page. And in this individual movement from pictures to words, ontogeny endlessly recapitulates phylogeny. The educational development of the individual child repeats the cultural development of the human race, or at least a widely accepted version of that development. In the 18th century, in his essay on the origin of languages, Jean-Jacques Rousseau plainly defines the movement from pictures to words as a process of cultural ascent. The depicting of objects, says Rousseau, is appropriate to a savage people, signs of words and of propositions to a barbaric people, and the alphabet to a civilized people. In our own time, Ernst Cassirer has redefined this development as an ascent from resemblance to signification. For Cassirer, language undergoes three stages: the mimetic stage of sound painting, wherein sounds are onomatopoetically used to reproduce individual sensory impressions as faithfully as possible; the analogical stage, where a sequence of sounds designates a sequence of contents; and the symbolic stage, wherein language achieves its true freedom by casting off its sensuous covering and becoming, quote, precisely in and by virtue of its otherness, the vehicle of a new and deeper spiritual content. Get rid of the image, get rid of the clothing of the visual, and you achieve true intellectual content. In this puritanical or quasi-Platonic polarization of flesh and spirit, we see even more clearly what is ideologically at stake in the separation of words from pictures, from their contaminating and corruptive influence, from their pernicious tendency to drag us back to infancy and barbarism. Plato vilified painters just as much as he vilified poets, because painters, he argued, aim to deceive and manipulate our senses, the lowest part of us. And when Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the words of God written on 2 tablets and discovered that Aaron had made a golden calf, he broke the tablets, pulverized the calf, and returned for a new set of tablets that begin by forbidding every form of visual representation. You must not carve an image for yourself in the shape of anything that is in the heavens above, or that is on the earth below, or that is in the waters under the earth. Happily for the history of art, Christianity has widely ignored this commandment. Only the Muslims take it literally from the Moses they call Muhammad. Yet a powerful strain of iconoclasm permeates the history of Western culture, and anyone who has ever been on either side of an argument about how much television children should be allowed to watch knows that iconoclasm and iconophobia, the fear of images, are very much alive and well in our society. Normally, however, the guardians of verbal culture, the culture of literacy, do not go about smashing television sets or slashing canvases or hacking statuary to pieces. Recognizing that images are here to stay, the guardians of the word simply aim to keep images at a suitable distance, to wall them out as much as possible, to establish a border and guard it firmly. Can I have the lights down, please? Hence their cries of alarm when the border between word and image is crossed. Here is Wordsworth. In the middle of the 19th century, a grand old man of 76, voicing his Mosaic outrage at the spectacle of illustrated books and newspapers. Discourse was deemed man's noblest attribute, and written words the glory of his hand. Then followed printing with enlarged command for thought dominion vast and absolute, for spreading truth and making love expand. Now prose and verse, sunk into disrepute, must lackey a dumb art that best can suit the taste of this once intellectual land. A backward movement surely have we here, from manhood back to childhood, for the age back toward caverned life's first rude career. Avaunt this vile abuse of pictured page. Must eyes be all in all, the tongue and ear nothing? Heaven keep us from a lower stage. Discourse, words, are man's noblest attribute. Written words are the product of civilized adult minds raised far above the level of infancy and barbarous scratching and daubing on the walls of caves. Art is dumb, which means silent, and has no right to enter the domain of discourse, to trespass on the sacred precincts of the printed page. Now, this little-known sonnet could, of course, be dismissed as the irrelevant squawk of a cranky old man. But however intemperate Wordsworth may sound, his iconoclasm reflects a long tradition of thought about what the relation between words and pictures should be, and to a large extent, these views persevere and prevail in our own time. Newspapers and magazines use pictures often, and various kinds of picture books abound, but the illustrated novel is or was a 19th century phenomenon that we have left behind. Virtually all of what we now consider literature, fiction, poetry, and nonfiction, consists of text unaccompanied by pictures. There are a few exceptions, perhaps the most notable of which is the graphic novel exemplified by Art Spiegelman's Mouse, which uses a comic book format to tell the story of how a Polish Jew survived the Holocaust. The Jews are mice, the Poles are pigs, the Germans are cats. W.G. Sebald's Austerlitz also includes a number of photographs. There are a few examples of this kind. I think it's fair to say, for the most part, works of fiction and poetry are unadorned by pictures. But Spiegelman stands out, of course, by contrast. In using pictures to tell a story, Spiegelman is violating what is commonly taken to be a law essential to pictures, or at least to painting, to high art, to art that is worthy of the name. When art tries to tell stories, it regresses to the primitive age of fresco cycles or descends to the childish, semi-literate world of the comic book. Since the Renaissance, the dominant conception of what a painting does, or rather should do, derives from Leon Battista Alberti's De Pictura, 1435. According to Alberti, a painting represents what can be seen from one point of view at one moment of time. It is this conception of painting that informs the most influential of all treatises on literature and the visual arts, G.E. Lessing's Laocoon, first published in 1766. Setting out to reestablish the limits of painting and poetry, as his subtitle tells us, Lessing argues that painting is fundamentally spatial, literature fundamentally temporal. Succession of time, he writes, is the province of the poet, just as space is that of the painter. It is an intrusion of the painter onto the domain of the poet, which good taste can never sanction, when the painter combines in one and the same picture 2 points necessarily separate in time, unquote. What's striking about this well-known formulation is not just the categorical rigor of its language, but the geopolitical metaphors in which it is couched: province, domain, intrusion. Lessing even goes on to talk about aggression across the frontiers. As Foucault has shown us, the making of categories is an exercise of power. Lessing's whole treatise is a classic piece of legislation calculated to reaffirm the power of the word and contain the power of the image. In fact, Lessing explicitly says the plastic arts have an effect that demands close supervision by the law. Where are you, John Ashcroft? Huh? For Lessing, the first duty of art is to be beautiful, to represent beauty in space. All else, expression, narration, meaning, must be subordinate to the law of beauty, which demands silence. What would happen to the Mona Lisa, he might say, if the lips of that hauntingly inscrutable face were suddenly to open and speak? What would come out of them? A recipe for lasagna? A Medicean question about the weather? We cannot have speech from paintings. Paintings must be beautiful and silent, pretty and dumb. To recognize here the terms in which men have traditionally defined the role of women is to see more clearly how visual art has been subordinated to language. It is no accident that the female face and figure, clothed and unclothed, has for centuries occupied such a central place in painting and sculpture, in beautiful works of art presented for the gaze and voyeuristic delectation of men. The notion that pictures are silent, or should be silent, goes hand in hand with the notion that they are windows through which we see a reality that speaks for itself without words, a reality that speaks directly to the eye. To see pictures in this way is to believe that they give us direct, unmediated access to what they represent, instead of requiring that we decode and interpret them as graphic signs, cultural constructions of meaning. In the 17th century, John Dryden wrote that painting speaks, quote, the tongue of every land, unquote. What was claimed for painting in the 17th century is claimed even more insistently now for photography. A recently distributed poster proclaims, the world speaks in 1994 languages, but sees in only one, photography, the universal language. Unsurprisingly, this poster is published by the International Photography Council, which has a more than incidental interest in promoting the notion that photographs are universally intelligible. In fact, of course, they are not, which is why most photographs are printed with captions that determine their meaning. Take, for instance, this photograph of a man lying beside a stone wall with a rifle propped against it. He might be propped there, see if you can see that clearly here. Let's see. Yeah, there he is right here. He might be sprawled there in sheer exhaustion. He might be posing for some reason. This could be a movie still. Or he might be dead. But even supposing him dead, we can only guess how he died. Heart attack, knife in the back, accidental wound from his own rifle, bullet from someone else's rifle, and we have no idea where. In fact, this picture was taken in July 1863, after the Battle of Gettysburg, and when it was published, the caption identified it as a rebel sharpshooter slain at his post. What the caption did not say is that the photographer, Alexander Gardner, had earlier snapped the same corpse in a different place and from a different angle, and identified it as a Union soldier. He then dragged the corpse up to a stone barricade in order to make or make up the picture of a slain rebel. Many pictures can be interpreted without the aid of captions, of course, but only by those already familiar with the graphic signs they deploy. Consider this unofficial White House photograph. Hardly a record of anyone's perception, this would-be photograph is something constructed to represent Nancy Reagan as the one who wore the pants for the Reagan family when Ronald was in the White House. To read this picture correctly, we must have some knowledge of the culture that it represents. We must have seen at least one other picture of the Reagans with an identifying caption, which is how we learn to recognize famous faces. And we must have been trained to recognize certain kinds of clothing, pants, neckties, and dresses, as culturally generated signs of gender, signs that are manipulated here. This line of analysis leads us to the point taken by Nelson Goodman, who argues that there is no such thing as resemblance between pictures and what they represent, that what we call realism is purely a matter of inculcation. Almost any picture, he says, may represent almost anything. That is, given picture and object, there is usually a system of representation, a plan of correlation, under which the picture represents the object. Goodman's point could be illustrated by the photograph of the man on the ground, which, as we have just seen, can be made to represent any one of a number of things, or by the deliberately ambiguous picture of a rabbit duck, which may be taken as a duck, a rabbit, or a composite of the two. Or by drawings such as this one, made by William Hogarth. Rather, this is actually my attempt to reproduce the drawing described by Hogarth, the great 18th century English printmaker. Hogarth made a drawing like this to show, with just 3 lines, that he could represent a grenadier entering a tavern with a rifle over his shoulder and a dog beside him. In all these cases, we are told what to see. We see by means of language and graphic convention, which together forge the link between the drawing and what it represents. But examples like these, which seem to confirm Goodman's theory, must be said examples that challenge it. What are we to say, for instance, about works of superrealism, such as John Salt's 58 Ford with White Hood, 1973? To this question, Goodman might reply that what the picture resembles is not an object but a photograph. It takes the photograph as its model of representation, and its realism of effect depends, as Linda Chase has noted, on its heightening of certain effects that we normally associate with photography, its unsentimental sharpness of focus, its capacity to capture a fleeting moment of light, and its acute sensitivity to shiny and reflective surfaces. Realism is relative, says Goodman. It is determined by the system of representation standard for a given culture or person at a given time. If it is fair to say that the photograph now constitutes the prevailing standard of realism in our culture, then Saltz's picture could be called conventionally realistic. It looks realistic only because it deploys the conventions we now associate with realism and thus confirms Goodman's theory. But suppose we consider some of the oldest known examples of representation extant, namely the cave paintings of Lascaux, France, dating from what Wordsworth calls caverned life's first rude career, the Paleolithic era, about 14,000 BC. Among other things, the Lascaux paintings represent what are generally acknowledged to be a variety of animals, a bison, horse, stags, and a bull. These pictures come to us without words. Writing did not come along until about 6,000 years later, and without any contextual information. We have no other access to the culture that produced these pictures or to the graphic conventions on which they depend, yet we can recognize what these pictures represent. And whatever makes this recognition possible, it cannot be explained by common access to a set of culturally generated conventions. What can explain it? A possible answer comes to us from E.H. Gombrich, again, who posits something like a graphic or right-brain counterpart of our inborn capacity to learn languages, what Noam Chomsky calls linguistic competence. Gombrich has developed a theory of what might be called pictorial competence. The effect of resemblance or the illusion of reality that we get from pictures, he says, is created by visual clues corresponding to the bits of information we seek from natural objects in order to know what they are. For Gombrich, a picture is not a facsimile of nature, but a relational model which simulates mental activities similar to those aroused by natural objects. Thus, the contrast between white and gray pigment in a picture may lead us to see a patch of brilliant sunlight on a white tablecloth, even though neither one of the pigments matches the color that it represents. So for Gombrich, painting is an act of encoding. The images are not replicas of natural objects, but signals that must be decoded before their meaning as representations can be understood. With all this emphasis on encoding and decoding, Gombrich sounds very much like Nelson Goodman. But the two are quite different. For Goodman, who is a thoroughgoing conventionalist, the connections we make between a picture and what it represents are wholly relative, wholly determined by acculturation. For Gombrich, the experience of pictorial resemblance or illusion is made possible by natural or automatic mechanisms of recognition, mechanisms that prompt even animals and primitive peoples to respond to pictured objects as if they were real ones. According to Gombrich, we are universally programmed to decode visual signals so that, as he says, what looks like a leaf to modern Europeans must also have looked like a leaf to predators in fairly distant geological epochs. So for all the intricacy of his analysis, Gombrich ends up reaffirming the familiar notion that painted objects naturally resemble real ones. So that we need no more than animal instinct to decode them. To prove that painted objects naturally resemble real ones, he says he likes to remind extreme relativists that paintings can deceive animals. In so doing, he recalls Pliny's famous story of the birds who came to peck at the painted grapes of Zeuxis, or Leonardo's list of similar examples, dogs barking and trying to bite painted dogs, and a monkey doing an infinite number of stupid things in front of a painted monkey. Ironically enough, this comment comes from an essay written to show that painting has intellectual and spiritual ends, that it reveals the action of the mind in bodily motions. But how much mental activity can painting signify if it aims simply to duplicate visible appearances, to deceive the eye, to make a monkey out of the viewer? So long as viewing a picture means being deceived by it, we cannot experience representation as such, which requires a consciousness of the difference between painted objects and real ones, between signifier and signified. The barking dog who tries to bite a painted one does not construe a painted shape as the sign or simulacrum of a dog. He sees a dog. So the concept of painting as illusion is ultimately fatal to the enterprise of reading pictures or learning how to read them. This is why Gombrich's version of art history finally reaches a dead end. For Gombrich, the history of art is a progress toward ever more exact resemblance between the appearance of a painting and the appearance of the world it represents. Painting proceeds by a sequence of making and matching, constructing a schema and then correcting it as artists gradually become more expert in forging the keys with which to open the locks of our senses. So Renaissance art is more sophisticated than medieval art because the techniques of linear perspective make it seem much more realistic than its two-dimensional predecessor, much closer to the three-dimensional world of our experience. But to conceive the history of art as a progress toward ever more exact resemblance is to be balked and bewildered by the abstract art of the 20th century and to be virtually dyslexic before any art that is culturally coded. Gombrich's theory can accommodate equivalence between abstract paintings and invisible things, moods, sounds, states of mind, but it cannot explain or evaluate any work of art except insofar as it matches what it represents. The matching game too easily becomes a trap. The picture which holds traditionally philosophy captive, writes Richard Rorty, is that of the mind as a great mirror. Without the notion of the mind as a mirror, the notion of knowledge as accuracy of representation would not have suggested itself. Without this larger notion, the strategy common to Descartes and Kant, getting more accurate representations by inspecting, repairing, and polishing the mirror, so to speak, would not have made much sense. Gombrich's theory of making and matching in the history of art amounts to inspecting, repairing, and polishing the mirror or window of art, the two metaphors that have traditionally dominated theories of graphic representation. Learning to read pictures, even representational pictures as distinct from abstract ones, means cracking the mirror and breaking out of the window pane paradigm. In a painting of 1934, Rene Magritte represents a broken window under which we can see fragments of a painted sunset. The painting is called Le Soir qui tombe, the night which falls. Magritte playfully literalizes the trite metaphor, even as he deconstructs the metaphorical equation of painting with a window. With its self-shattering illusionism, the picture simultaneously draws the eye through the window and balks our vision. The sunset that we seem to see through a frame of jagged edges in the middle of the picture is just as opaque and two-dimensional as the images we find on the fragments at the bottom. A more disturbing statement about graphic representation is made by a painting Magritte produced a few years earlier than this one, Ceci n'est pas une pipe. This is not a pipe. This notorious picture has provoked a steady stream of commentary. But as Rudolf Arnheim probably speaks for all first-time viewers of it when he says, with endearing simplicity, "Unfortunately, a pipe is all it is." A little more thought about the picture and its legend leads to the next step, which is to say that what we are looking at is not a pipe, but a picture of a pipe. I once heard E.H. Gombrich say this with the greatest of scorn, as if he had boldly exposed some monstrous sham. Having seen that this is not a pipe, but a picture of a pipe, we are now ready to take the next step, which is to consider just how the pipe is pictured. Since the pipes we see in the real world do not usually present themselves in perfect profile or hang suspended in midair with no visible means of support, we must conclude that this is not, after all, a picture of a pipe, but rather, as Michel Butor observes, a picture of depiction, a picture of the way pipes are commonly represented in advertisements and textbooks, isolated, radically decontextualized, and labeled pipe. Thus, Magritte's title or legend, which is literally written along the bottom of the painting itself, parodies the textbook labeling of pictures and undermines the assumptions on which such labeling is based. Instead of implying, as labels typically do, that the picture is identical with a particular object, the label denies that identification and turns the picture into an arbitrary sign, a pipe picture, as Nelson Goodman would call it, just as one might say a round picture or a square picture, a pipe picture that can signify anything at all, dreams, complacency, desire, narcissism, Freud, what you will. Its meaning is no more bound to a particular object than is the meaning of the word ceci below it, which can mean any one of several things. This image above it, right here, this whole painting in which it appears, or the very word itself, right? Which presents itself not only verbally but visually. Right? Ceci is at once a sliding signifier and a graphic sign, a carefully drawn picture of a written word. In fact, the calligraphic shape of the C's in this word, makes them visually rhyme with the pictured shape just above them. There's the C, you see, in the shape of the pipe itself. Thus, Magritte deconstructs the opposition between the natural meaning of images and the arbitrary signification of words, even as he cuts the cable binding images to real objects to determinable reference. In cutting the cable of reference, Magritte's images also radically challenge the concept of viewing that has governed traditional art history. Traditional art history posits a viewer who gazes objectively and unilaterally at a painting from one fixed point, operating within the Albertian system of perspective. But as Michael Holley observes, Magritte's work undermines this paradigm. In The False Mirror, 1928, where a cloudscape is set within a huge staring eye, the viewer becomes an object of sight, and the traditional opposition between subject and object breaks down. To read the history of art itself in light of such a painting is to be reminded that works of art are not simply passive recipients of the spectator's univocal gaze, but agents of scrutiny that can look back at us. As in Velázquez's Las Meninas, where in fact the painter is looking out in our direction, right here on the left is the painter with his canvas looking out at us, or even more dramatically in Monet's Olympia, where she is gazing at us and appraising us. Right? Furthermore, whether or not they represent eyes or figures looking back at us, pictures can challenge the supremacy of the viewing subject by refusing to submit to a unilateral act of visual appropriation or repeatedly resisting our inferences about what they mean. Learning to read pictures, then, means learning to heed the often ambiguous and contradictory messages that they convey, as well as to grapple with their indeterminacy, their refusal to be categorically identified with either material objects or words, verbal articulations of their meaning. At one extreme, this double refusal seems to have been epitomized by the abstract or non-objective art of the early 20th century, which programmatically renounced both referentiality and language. In 1940, in an essay called Toward a Newer Laocoon, Clement Greenberg acclaimed what he saw as the purity of abstract art, its noble retreat behind the border that Lessing had drawn between literature and painting. To Greenberg's immense satisfaction, art by 1940 had purged itself of literature's corrupting influence. It had turned away from verbalizable meaning to concentrate on the physical, the sensorial. Paradoxically, this shift from word to flesh and matter was for Greenberg a rite of purification. The avant-garde arts, he wrote, have in the last 50 years, up to 1940, achieved a purity and a radical delimitation in their fields of activity for which there is no previous example in the history of culture. The arts lie safe now, each within its legitimate boundaries, and free trade has been replaced by autarky. Purity in art consists in the acceptance, willing acceptance, of the limitations of the medium of a specific art. But art did not long endure this orgone box of purity. If the arts were ever safe from literature and referentiality, as Greenberg claimed, they have long since been corrupted again. With pop art and superrealism, actual words and precisely recognizable images return to the canvas. On the left side of Roy Lichtenstein's Eddie Diptych of 1962, words displace the image. In Dick Johnson's The Hay Wain of 1991, words invade the image. This picture is flagrantly transgressive. Like Lichtenstein, Johnson crosses the border between high art and low by adopting the comic book device of using a balloon to signify speech. And the whole painting ruptures the border between the image and the word. As the punning title indicates, John Constable's celebrated painting of the Hay Wain, John Constable's celebrated painting of a hay wain or wagon crossing the stream is here displaced by a pickup truck labeled Wayne the Painter, a phrase that reminds us how the very word painter can straddle the border between artist and workman. So here's a picture that quite literally demands to be read as well as seen. But since reading pictures goes well beyond reading whatever words they may happen to contain or display in their titles, we may turn at this point to the work of Erwin Panovsky, who has probably done more than any other art historian of the earlier 20th century to explain just how visual art generates meaning. Panovsky's theory of pictorial meaning applies only to representational art, however, and is useful chiefly for the religious art of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, for art in which religious or intellectual meanings are demonstrably embedded, or, to put this another way, for art which seems to demand decoding. What we have in this kind of art, says Panovsky, are three layers of meaning. First, the factual meaning of pictured forms as objects, a hat, a peach, a knife, is something we recognize from practical experience modified by a knowledge of the history of style, of the way objects are represented in different historical periods. Second, the conventional meaning is what we recognize by iconographical analysis of the meanings assigned to particular objects in scripture and literature. Third, the symbolic meaning is what we divine by synthesizing all the other meanings we have gleaned from the first two layers of picture. So, basically, we need two things to read the kind of art Panovsky treats: iconography and the history of style. We learn iconography from labeled images, like the Italian Quattrocento relief of an old man with three faces, where the label prudenza, prudence, tells us that the three-faced head is not a freak, but a graphic sign of prudence as circumspection, the art of looking out on all sides. We also learn iconography from scripture and other literary sources, which may link particular images to specific abstractions or saints. Besides iconography, we must learn something about the history of style, about the way objects are typically represented during a given period. Thus, in the medieval miniature called Christ Resurrecting the Youth of Nine, about the year 1000, a walled town seems miraculously to be standing in space above the figures. But in early medieval painting, empty space does not signify actual space or the sky. It is just the pictorial ground on which images are drawn. Like Magritte's pipe, the walled town is detached and decontextualized, except for the semicircular base on which each of its towers stands. And that's the signal that this is, in fact, it's been uprooted from the ground, or rather, like Magritte's pipe, the walled town is detached and decontextualized, except for the semicircular baseline of each tower, which suggests, as Panovsky says, the hilly ground from which the town has been uprooted. Placed over the figures, it represents the town in which the resurrection took place. On the other hand, when we see an infant in the sky, Roger van de Weden's 15th century vision of the three magi, the comparably realistic qualities of the picture authorize us to see the space at the top of the top as the sky, and therefore to read the floating infant as an apparition. The great merit of Panovsky's approach is that it prompts us to move beyond the window pane paradigm for painting, to construe pictured objects as graphic signs, and to see how those signs work together to generate visual meaning. The problem with his system is that it can too easily become formulaic and reductive, translating images into words with the aid of an iconographic dictionary that makes no allowance for ambiguity or indeterminacy, for the ways in which the painting looks back at us and questions our inferences. I'm going to skip just a little bit here because I see that my time is running out, and I want to we're going to pass over Arnold Feeney and get, to here, to Constable. One of several problems with Panovsky's method of reading pictures is that it tells us virtually nothing about pictures in which the whole sphere of secondary or conventional subject matter has been eliminated, as in European landscape painting, such as this. Such pictures, says Panovsky, effect a direct transition from motifs, that is, pictured objects, to content. Yet the transition from motifs to content is often anything but direct in European landscape painting, especially when the factual meaning of a graphic configuration, the object that it represents, cannot be readily identified. So Panovsky's point is if you have a picture of a tree, well, it's a tree, and we don't need to say anything more about that. It's only when we get into iconography and other matters that we need special training. Okay. Take, for instance, Constable's Dead in Vale, 1828. Here is the kind of composition Constable learned to produce from his study of Claude Lorraine. All right. This is Hogarth and the Angel. Unfortunately, I think I managed to get that reversed somehow or other. But in any case, this is a painting Constable practically worshipped. In Constable's painting, as in Claude's, you have the foreground trees at right and at left, framing a vista where a river meanders through the middle ground to the seacoast with its church tower in the background there, in clouds, billowing white clouds overhead. The lure of the vista is reinforced by chiaroscuro, which draws the eye over the shadowy foreground to the sunlit vista beyond. But if we resist this picturesque lure and look carefully into the shadows, we can see what is just barely discernible there. I have to go over the Claude now. Namely, a mother and child lurking here in the shadows. I'll give you a close-up of that tail. You can see it perhaps even more clearly right here, where you have this mother and child lurking in the shadows. Vagrant mother and her infant cooking on an open fire beside a crude tent. You can perhaps just barely make out that tent right here that mimics in its triangular shape the much more comfortable and substantial dwellings that you find in the middle distance. Now, just what is the factual meaning here, the objects depicted? This is precisely the question posed by the picture as it challenges our view of its picturesque composition. Since the structures in the middle distance look much more like the way houses are commonly depicted, especially in picture books, than the shadowy tent in the foreground, we are unlikely to recognize the tent as a home unless perhaps we happen to have spent a few months camping out in one for lack of rent money. The composition literally tempts us to overlook the tent and the figures beside it here and to concentrate on the middle distance and the background of the clouds and so forth. The figures beside that tent merely hover on the edge of determinable signification or factual meaning. According to John Barrell, a critic of distinctly Marxist persuasion, Constable does not allow the impoverished mother and child to emerge from the shadows and solicit our pity. Instead, they are little more than a spot of red and a spot of white, right? A spot of red and a spot of white. Mother and child become proto-impressionistic bits of chromatic texture in a composition governed by the formal patterns of chiaroscuro, and their shadowy lair is merely a foil to the glowing vista that we alone, not they, can see. Now, this is a plausible line of interpretation except for one thing. It does not explain why Constable enables us to recognize the destitution of the figures and why, for all their shadowiness, they are the most conspicuous figures that we can see in the painting. They're also the only counterpart that we can find to the biblical figures that appear in the foreground of Claude Lorraine's Hogarth and the Angel, the picture that Constable was reconstructing. When we recall that Hagar was an outcast, a serving woman expelled from Abraham's household after she conceived his child, then it becomes more than possible to see the foreground figures in Constable's painting as contemporary outcasts, figures that society has no place for, but that the artist, whatever his politics, cannot fail to notice and represent. They cannot simply be reduced to bits of picturesque texture. So Dead in Vale is Constable's way of recreating what was once called history painting, the painting of a biblical or mythological subject. Reconceiving the traditional relation between landscape and the figures who populate it, he makes Claude's biblical outcast give way to the human debris of contemporary history, to barely personified spots of life, nameless figures who play no visible part on the stage of public events, but quietly insist on taking their place in the landscape of contemporary human experience. In recalling Claude's Hogarth, Constable's painting aligns itself with precisely the kind of formal structures that Panovsky's theory of pictorial meaning is equipped to explain. but in radically destabilizing the factual meaning of the figures in the picture, in painting daubs of color whose meaning depends on the very fact that we can barely recognize what they materially signify. In doing all that, Constable detonates the ground on which Panovsky's theory of pictorial meaning rests. When the factual meaning of a picture cannot be simply taken for granted as the ground on which reading proceeds, Panovsky's theory of pictorial meaning simply will not apply. And I'm going to skip, well, let's see here. I'm going to skip make one more little skip here. I talk about a medieval work on, a rather complicated medieval work on ivory. I'm going to skip over that one and move on to this. Among the things that Panovsky's theory doesn't sufficiently explain, the multiple meanings of certain figures or motifs. That was part of that. Okay. I want to go to this 14. That was a long discussion of that. Now we can take a bit more time with Botticelli and some other pictures here. I want to consider this as a 1485 altarpiece by Botticelli, which shows the Virgin and Child seated between John the Baptist at left and John the Evangelist at right. The title of the picture suggests that Mary is conversing with the two saints, but neither one of them is looking at her, which is the first sign that they may not be conversing at all. John the Baptist, in fact, right here, is looking at us and gesturing to the infant, to the one whose coming he was ordained to announce. While in real time John the Baptist was only 6 months older than Christ, here a mature Baptist heralds the newborn Christ. While in real time John the Evangelist, over here, of course, on the right, in real time John the Evangelist wrote his gospel after Christ's death, here the writing is juxtaposed with Christ's birth and death, the death signified by the crucifix at the bottom of the picture, down here. The evangelist writes in words the text that is rewritten in pigment for us. A single picture signifies many moments, the beginning and end of Christ's life, the announcement of his coming, and the act of verbally recording it all. 3 centuries later, G.M.W. Turner likewise yoked a biblical event and the recording of it in a painting titled Light and Color, the morning after the deluge, Moses writing book of Genesis. There is a rather slim-looking Moses writing the book of Genesis. When the picture was exhibited in 1843, it was censured, it was criticized for, quote, an anachronism that the meanest scholar at a parish school could rectify. The reviewer simply could not read a multi-temporal work of art. To read such a work, we must, of course, suspend the long-standing assumption that painting is unitemporal, right? Or that you could imagine Moses writing the book of Genesis within the situation in which the Genesis is actually occurring, okay? To read such a work, we must, of course, suspend the long-standing assumption that painting is a unitemporal art. Born in the 15th century with Alberti's rules for perspective and codified by Lessing in the 18th century, the notion that painting can represent only what can be seen at a single moment from a single point of view has come to assume the status of a sacred, unalterable law. This law severely constrains pictorial narrative. A single painting can represent what Lessing calls the most suggestive moment of a narrative, so as to imply what precedes and follow it, but cannot actually depict more than one moment of time, cannot show one or more figures performing temporally successive acts, Lessing laying down the law. But why should painting be forbidden to repeat one or more figures to show them performing temporally successive acts? Is the prohibition essential to visual art, or just an historically imposed convention? The very existence of paintings that defy this convention prove it to be historically imposed, widely but not universally accepted, and by no means essential to the medium of painting. Benozzo Gozzoli's Quattrocento Dance of Salome and the Beheading of St. John the Baptist represent three temporally distinct episodes. In the center foreground, Salome dances for Herod while her mother stands watching. By the end of the table, at left, John the Baptist is beheaded, and in the rear, Salome presents the head to her mother. Okay? Three temporally successive acts presented to us in one canvas. This, of course, is not quite a self-explanatory narrative. Since Gozzoli's picture does not chart an itinerary for the eye, we cannot know for sure the order of these episodes without a prior knowledge of the story depicted, nor does the picture explain the causal link between Salome's dance and the beheading of John. So, in other words, you have to know that the order is the beheading, the dance, and the presentation of the head on the platter, right? You have to know something about the story in order to be able to read the order of elements in the picture. But literary works can likewise tell stories in drastically edited form, and they too can presuppose prior knowledge. In a poem called Leda and the Swan, Yeats begins by describing the rape of Leda and then writes, "A shudder in the loins engenders there the broken wall, the burning roof and tower, and Agamemnon dead." To read these lines, we must already know how to apply the missing narrative links. Leda begot Helen. Paris's abduction of Helen begot the Trojan War, which led to the breaching of the Trojan War, and ultimately, by another long chain of events, to the death of Agamemnon. Now, it may be argued that whether or not painting is inherently capable of narrative, the invention of perspective in the 15th century made pictorial narrative the invention of perspective in the 15th century made pictorial narrative obsolete. But are Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel frescoes obsolete? Painted in the early 16th century, these not only work in sequence to represent successive moments of biblical history, some of them are multi-temporal all by themselves. Here in a single fresco that can be read sequentially, here is a single fresco that can be read sequentially, even as it is viewed spatially. Spatially, the strong central trunk of the serpent-wound tree divides the picture into two symmetrical halves, with the two bending figures on the right balancing the two on the left, and the outstretched arms of the figures on top forming an arch that embraces all of them. Right? There's that arch of outstretched arms. Temporally, the tree, however, is a pivot on which the figures are turned as if by serpentine torque from temptation to expulsion. The arms are eloquent, while the outstretched arms of the figures at left express seduction and desire. The outstretched arms of the figures at right signify menace and fear. In addition, pressure of sequence and change affects the spatial symmetry of the whole composition, keeping the left-hand figures well within the left edge while pushing the two up to the right one as if they were being driven right out of the picture. Michelangelo's fresco prefigures what might be read as a contemporary version of the story of the fall, namely Sally Mann's Sunday Funnies, 1991. This photograph of three children sprawled on a large bed and separately entranced by various pages of comics is, among other things, a picture about reading, and thus takes its place in the fascinating but so far unrecognized genre or subgenre of what might be called lectoral art, including works such as Jan Vermeer's Young Woman Reading a Letter at an Open Window, and Winslow Homer, the new novel. Lectoral art is an art of absorption, which is what Sunday Funnies offers us. Wholly absorbed by their reading, the children ignore both the camera and each other. Unlike the female nude seated in the foreground of Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe, who looks straight out at us, they give no sign of awareness that they are on display or objects of our gaze. But of course they are. Their absorption in reading cannot mask the emergence of their sexuality or the imminence of their fall into sexual difference. In Mann's photograph, as in Manet's painting, this difference is highlighted by the contrast between female flesh and male clothing. Mann's two girls lie totally nude in the foreground, while the boy in the background wears shorts. I first saw this picture in the High Museum in Atlanta, and I happened to see a girl of about 16, maybe 15 or 14, something, standing before the picture for approximately 20 seconds. And the only thing she said to her friend was, "The boy is the only one wearing any clothes." And then she walked away. It's a very interesting comment. And it's quite true, of course. The boy is the only one wearing clothes. Resting on his back with his head on a pillow, propped against the corner of a wall, chin on his chest, body half turned on its side. There he is there. He looks down at a folded page of the comics that he stands up with his left hand. The slightest raising of his eyes would let him see the naked girl stretched out immediately before him. And this alluring creature, a veritable Lolita, personifies the ambiguity of pre-adolescence. She looks somewhat older than the girl lying prone on the left with her chin in her hands, a girl whose plump little body is still that of a child. The older girl is already on her way to womanhood, while the hand of her fully extended left arm, the only straight limb in a cluster of bent ones, absently and childishly hooks a finger around the big toe of her right foot, right there. All that's happening. The hand of her fully extended left arm, the only straight limb in a cluster of bent ones, absently and childishly hooks a finger around the big toe of her right foot, which has been crossed with her left one. While all that is happening, the bright, thick ponytail of hair falling straight down over her shoulder frames the nipple of her nascent left breast, and between that and her bent knees, the cave of her slim midsection is mystified by shadow. Shadows assume a special force in this picture because it is shot in black and white, a medium that negates the garish, one might say childish, colors of its nominal subject matter, the Sunday funnies. Lying on a bed covered with what seems to be a hand-stitched quilt, the colors too are blanked out, reading the comics by a sunlight pouring through the big screens of their tree-fringed country cabin with a river flowing just outside, the children evoke a would-be golden age before our cultural fall, time when children lived, played, and even read in the sun, instead of hunkering down by a flickering screen filled with nothing but rivers of violence, sex, and endless exhortations to buy. Reading the pictures and the words of the comics, the children even recall the girl and boy. I have to go a couple forward here. They even recall the girl and boy on the title page of Blake's Songs of Innocence, 1789, children shown reading outdoors under a tree from a book that may well be the Songs itself, a set of illustrated or illuminated poems etched and hand-colored, stained for the enjoyment of every child. But Blake's Songs of Innocence are quite literally bound to his Songs of Experience, and even on the title page of Innocence, the vine encircling the tree, right here, prefigures the serpent of the fall. Let's now go back to Sunday Funnies. In Mann's photograph, a serpentine life seems to inform the bodies of the children themselves, twisting them, bending their limbs, and undulating the right arm of the girl with the ponytail. Furthermore, what entrances these children, none of whom laughs or even smiles at the funnies, is nothing handmade or homemade like Blake's Songs or the quilt they're lying on, but is rather a product of print technology. Technology brought color to comics just as it later brought color to television, where the use of black and white in commercials now typically signified the unspecified past. What do the colorless lights and shadows of the photographs signify? An innocent, sunlit past? The imminence of a darkening future? If the story of Genesis tempts us to read the process of growing up as a reenactment of the fall, or to read the onset of puberty as the beginning of all the pain bred by the expression and repression of sexual desire, is there any way that sunlight itself, the very lamp of time, can be shielded from the effects of its passage? On the other hand, do we know for certain that growing up into a world of sexual longing and difference will, on balance, merely drive the children deeper into shadow? The picture leaves these questions unanswered. Even while prompting us to read the supple bodies of the reading children, it makes them finally indeterminate, indecipherable, unreadable, beyond the reach of our words. To learn to read pictures, we must first unlearn most of what we have been conditioned to think of them. That a picture is a window or mirror, that it offers a perfectly transparent view of what it represents, that it constitutes a record of perception, that it cannot show more than what can be seen from a single vantage point at one point in time. Pictures, I suggest, are not records of momentary perception, but deliberate constructions, compositions made of graphic signs. To read these signs, we need more than a capacity to appreciate the beauty of formal patterns. We need all the help that our experience of reading verbal signs in language and literature can give us. Yet we have also seen, as we have also seen, learning to read pictures also means listening to the questions they raise and the challenges they pose to two kinds of authority. The authority of a univocal, one-point perspective, and the authority of the word. Any attempt to say what we see in a picture is subject to revision as soon as we begin to see how the picture looks back at us. Sally Mann's young girl is a figure that arrests the mind as well as the eye, for while the shadowed nudity of her developing form may provoke a voyeuristic pleasure, her mind is also growing in ways that we cannot see by the simple act of perusing the comics. To consider this a childish pastime we have long and well outgrown is to deny that pictures can make us think, a notion flagrantly contradicted by the very picture we are looking at, as well as by all the others I have discussed above. The largest question raised by this and any other picture worth looking at is not what to say about it, but how far or whether we can speak for it at all. Thank you. Sure. Is this too distracting? Shall I take it off? There. The light is not terribly good, so I'm going to have to look hard to see there are hands raised. Certainly hope I haven't silenced you all. That's not the intention. I ask myself a question. Can't think of any. It certainly wasn't intended to be definitive either. Although it is. Yes? The Sally Mann. Yeah. Through break rather than through? Ah, right. Okay, fine. Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering how the image might look to you as a reflection of the Manet sort of, shall we say, exploration of sort of compositional tropes, convention, as a sort of character.
Sorry, to read Sally Mann as a parody of Monet?
No, or to read the photograph as one might read the Monet as a parody of pictorial standards, pictorial expectations.
Well, yes. I mean, there are lots of things one could do with that, which is why I brought in the Monet. It seems to me that really original paintings are typically, one might almost say typically, reformulations of earlier work, and that Sally Mann is partly addressing an audience, obviously an audience that is familiar with the depiction of the nude, and given the fact that you have the boy with pants on and the girl's unclothed, it seems to me that readers, even moderately familiar with the history of art are going to be thinking about Manet because, of course, that's one of the most striking things about the painting, that instead of simply presenting a nude to a clothed viewer standing out there, in the gallery, he's put the clothed men inside, and then also he's turned around the nude in such a way that she's looking at us and challenging us. I think that, what's interesting about this sort of comparison is that it alerts you to what is distinctively different about what Sally Mann is doing. First of all, the nudes are younger, and this is one of the things that was problematic and why Sally Mann has provoked a good deal of controversy. These are her own children that she's photographing, but they are of a sort of prepubescent age, and then there's this whole question and increasing anxiety now about the sexual exploitation of children. So she knows that she's flirting with danger, and as a matter of fact, when I requested permission to reproduce this in an article, I was told, I've sent this to the gallery that handles her pictures, and I was told that, yes, she would approve it, but she didn't like what I had to say about it. And I said, well, if you're going to give me the right to reproduce the picture, I think I have the right to my critical opinion. Maybe wrong. I think I have the right to critical opinion. And finally, this was resolved in my favor. It's the idea that Sally Mann should be alarmed that people are detecting sexual suggestions in this picture, it seems to me, is either incredibly naive or sort of willfully self-deluding or something. Anyway, younger children, first of all, and secondly, the fact that they are totally absorbed in their reading. This is an example of what, if this had been done in the 18th century, what Michael Fried was called a painting of absorption rather than of theatricality. He makes that fundamental distinction about painting in the 18th century. Theatrical paintings are paintings with figures who are clearly looking at us and inviting us to react to them, right? As Manet's Olympia is clearly inviting the viewer to look at her. Whereas this is a photograph of children who are totally absorbed in what they are reading, utterly oblivious of any viewer. They're not conscious that anybody is looking at them. So, a lot more, obviously, that one can say, but it seems to me that is part of one element of what might be called a dialogue, if you will, between Sally Mann and Manet, or this whole tradition of the depiction of nudes, of which the Manet is simply one example. Yes?
I was just thinking that, I don't have a strong associations of, the comic book as, a low art, and I think that holds true for a lot of different people.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you could agree that there was sort of a blurring between, low, high and low, and, what is textual, what is pictorial.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, right. No, I think that's what Spiegelman is doing, is deliberately crossing those boundaries between, not just between picture and text, but between the comic book, which is relegated traditionally to a certain time of one's life, and the real book, which doesn't have any pictures in it. Now, of course, we have the comic book not only in Spiegelman's hand, but which is now called the graphic novel. It's interesting that they use the phrase the graphic novel rather than comic book to talk about Spiegelman's work, but I think this is true in Europe perhaps more than here, in Italy in particular, that the comic book has sort of come back into its own, or maybe it really never left a certain group of high cultural readers who consume this kind of literature. But at the same time, I think it's safe to say that for most people, the comic book remains in that limbo of recollection. It's something that I can remember learning to read in part from comic books. I can literally remember learning the word crave from a comic book. They're a very important part, I think, of one's education. But that's the way most of us, would regard it. How many of you, I won't ask for show of hands, would be embarrassed to be found reading a comic book, right? In a public place. What are you doing with that? You'd have to explain it. Well, I'm reading Art Spiegelman and so forth, and that kind of thing. Yeah.
I'm not very sure the comic book idea, but question. This is about Botticelli piece.
Sorry?
Botticelli.
Yes.
And my question
Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm.
In the Botticelli,
Yep.
on the right-hand side is the picture of St. John the Evangelist.
Right. I think he's actually on the left. Excuse me. We can. I don't know if we can get this back here, just to purposes of, or is it, maybe the slide projector turned on. Okay, we remember it. Yeah. John the Baptist on. Oh, okay. Let's see. Go back quickly. There's nothing like having the painting before you. Yeah, there it is. Yeah, see. John the Baptist on the left, John the Evangelist on the right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think your talk sort of did with it, alerted me to the ways in which, of course, painting is in disjoint time. So we've got an older
Right.
John the Baptist, for example.
Sure.
What's particularly interesting about the use of the evangelist here is, of course, at the beginning of his gospel, we have that famous, and the Word became flesh.
Absolutely. One of the great lines in Scripture. Yeah.
How does Botticelli play with that line? He gives us the evangelist writing in empty space. Why? Because the Word has become flesh.
Mm-hmm.
So that in a way, what we see here is a painting
Yeah.
enacting him for a moment that
Right.
can only be explained across the line.
Yeah. Yeah. You're absolutely right. I think this is precisely a visualization, and I hadn't thought of that before. I think you're absolutely right. Precisely a visualization of that crucial line in the opening of John's Gospel, and the Word was made flesh. Askenazin is a Greek, and you know, it's interesting that the kai halogos sarx agenito kai askenazin enimen, I think is the Greek, where the Greek goes, and the Word was made flesh. And askenazin can mean build a shelter, and it's actually etymologically related to the word seen. So you might almost idiomatically say the Word was made flesh and made the scene among us, right? And there he is, right there, in front of you. So.
How do you explain the fact that the baby seems to be so precariously between her knees? That is, you know, if the baby had any weight,
Yeah.
it would be falling.
Yeah.
And the baby's looking at it and sort of reaching out to her.
Yeah.
What's your interpretation?
That's I would say your guess is as good as mine on that one. I mean, I would say that Botticelli is not quite so concerned with certain aspects of realism, say the representation of the body of the Virgin, right, beneath all those folds, that he's not quite so concerned as a later painter might be. But other than that, no, I mean, it's a legitimate complaint, but it has more significance than that. Because, yes, you're right, it doesn't look as though that lap is properly supporting the infant. Yeah. Catch that falling baby. No? Any more? Or is it time to drink and eat or something? Okay. Thank you very much.